There is someone lying awake at night because of you, and the strange part is you probably have no idea. Curious. The person who constantly made you doubt your own reality, who slowly convinced you to silence your opinions, hide your emotions, and reshape who you were just to avoid conflict. The one who always needed the final word, refused to accept responsibility, and somehow managed to leave every disagreement feeling like it was your fault. At this very moment, beneath the image they worked so hard to maintain, something is beginning to fall apart. Pause. It isn't happening because life suddenly punished them, or because the universe delivered instant justice. It isn't some dramatic movie scene where everything comes crashing down in a single moment. Thoughtful. The real reason they're struggling is much simpler. You stopped participating in the cycle that gave them power. By refusing to play their emotional game, you removed something they depended on far more than they ever wanted you to realize. Welcome to Narcissist Recovery. Today, we're uncovering the unmistakable signs that show your decision truly changed everything. This isn't about getting revenge or celebrating someone else's pain. It's about recognizing what genuine freedom looks like after escaping manipulation. Sometimes the greatest victory isn't making someone suffer. It's reaching the point where they no longer have the ability to control your emotions, your thoughts, or your life. Many people imagine defeating a narcissist as a loud emotional showdown. They picture exposing every lie, confronting every betrayal, and finally hearing the apology they've waited years to receive. They expect tears, dramatic confessions, or a moment where the narcissist finally admits the damage they caused. In reality, that almost never happens. The biggest misunderstanding about overcoming a narcissist is believing they will validate your experience before you can move on. They rarely provide that satisfaction because admitting fault threatens the identity they've built around appearing superior and blameless. Waiting for accountability often keeps people emotionally trapped far longer than the relationship itself. Real victory is much quieter. It often happens without an audience, without dramatic speeches, and without any public acknowledgement at all. Instead of appearing in your behavior, the evidence begins showing up in theirs. Their reactions become increasingly desperate because they can no longer influence the one thing they relied on most, your emotional investment. Once they realize they've truly lost access to you, they begin revealing parts of themselves they previously kept hidden. Ironically, their own actions become proof that you've already broken free. Let's begin with the first and one of the clearest signs. The smear campaign suddenly intensifies. This is the stage that confuses many survivors because on the surface, it feels like another attack. When false stories begin spreading, when mutual friends hear distorted versions of events, and when your character is suddenly questioned, it's easy to assume the narcissist still has power over you. The truth is often the exact opposite. A narcissist usually launches an aggressive smear campaign only after recognizing that genuine control has slipped away. As long as they could manipulate your emotions, keep you defending yourself, or pull you back into arguments, there was little reason to recruit other people. But once you stop reacting, stop explaining yourself, and stop chasing their approval, they begin searching for a new source of validation. That's when they start rewriting history. Conversations become exaggerated. Ordinary disagreements become stories where they're portrayed as the victim. Your healthy boundaries suddenly become cruel behavior. Your silence becomes proof that you were guilty all along. They begin planting these narratives among mutual friends, relatives, co-workers, or anyone willing to listen. If you pay close attention, you'll notice something important. The stories often contradict each other. Details change depending on who they're speaking to because the goal isn't accuracy. The goal is preserving the image they've carefully created while shifting responsibility away from themselves. Their reputation has become more important than the truth. When someone no longer responds to manipulation directly, the narcissist often attempts to regain influence indirectly through other people. The smear campaign isn't evidence that they're winning. More often, it's evidence that the strategy they relied on with you has completely stopped working, leaving them scrambling to rebuild control somewhere else. Before long, you start hearing strange things. Individuals you've barely spoken to suddenly seem to have strong opinions about your character. Conversations are happening about you in places you've never stepped foot in. Your name begins circulating through social circles you didn't even know existed. At first, it can feel unsettling. You may wonder how so many people became involved in something that was never their business, but understanding the psychology behind it changes everything. A narcissist survives through perception. Their sense of identity is heavily dependent on the image they project to others. In many ways, their confidence is built on a carefully managed version of reality, one where they are admired, misunderstood, wronged, or exceptional. That image requires constant maintenance because it isn't as stable as it appears. The moment you walk away, refuse to engage, establish boundaries, or stop reacting emotionally, you create a problem they can't easily solve. You become evidence that their version of the story is incomplete. Your absence raises questions. Your silence creates space for people to notice inconsistencies. Your refusal to participate removes an important character from the narrative they've spent years constructing. Suddenly, there is a loose thread hanging from the fabric of the identity they've carefully stitched together, and they know that if enough people pull on it, the entire illusion could begin to unravel. That's why the smear campaign becomes so intense. It isn't strength, it isn't confidence, it's emergency damage control. They're not spreading stories because they're secure in their position. They're doing it because they're trying desperately to reinforce a narrative that no longer feels safe. Every rumor, every exaggerated claim, every subtle attack is an attempt to patch a crack that's becoming harder and harder to hide. The louder they become, the more threatened they usually feel. Psychology has a name for what happens internally during moments like these: narcissistic injury. This term describes the profound emotional wound that occurs when a narcissist's self-image is challenged, contradicted, or exposed. To most people, criticism is uncomfortable. To a narcissist, it can feel devastating because it strikes directly at the identity they've built their entire emotional world around. What makes narcissistic injury so powerful is that it creates an intense need to restore control. When their self-image is threatened, they often respond with anger, blame, manipulation, or social retaliation. They must find a way to protect the version of themselves they need others to believe. That's why aggression often follows. Sometimes it's obvious and explosive. Other times it's subtle and calculated. It can appear as character assassination disguised as concern. It can sound like gossip presented as a warning. It can look like friendliness on the surface while carrying the hidden purpose of turning people against you. The smear campaign is often aggression dressed up as credibility, and while it feels personal, it's rarely about who you are. More often, it's about protecting who they need themselves to be. Now let's move to the second major sign that you've truly disrupted the cycle. The Hoover begins. The name sounds almost harmless, but the behavior behind it is anything but. The term hoovering comes from the idea of a vacuum cleaner because the narcissist is attempting to pull you back into their orbit after you've escaped it. This stage frequently appears after a period of silence. Sometimes it happens when the smear campaign fails to generate the reaction they expected. Other times it occurs when they realize you are genuinely moving forward and no longer emotionally available to them. That's when they suddenly reappear. You may receive an unexpected message after months of no contact. A random text arrives asking how you've been. They may like old photos, watch every social media story, send a vague apology, or reach out with a seemingly innocent question that could have been answered without contacting you at all. The approach is rarely accidental. What makes hoovering so confusing is that it often doesn't look hostile. In fact, it can appear surprisingly warm, nostalgic, or even remorseful. They may speak as though they've changed. They may reference happy memories. They may act as if enough time has passed for everything to be forgotten. But the real objective is often much deeper than simple reconciliation. The goal is to find out whether they still have access to you. Can they still trigger an emotional response? Can they still capture your attention? Can they still influence your decisions? Can they still occupy space in your mind whenever they choose? Those are the questions they're quietly trying to answer, because for a narcissist, losing control is difficult enough. Discovering that they've become irrelevant is often far more painful. When they sense that possibility becoming real, they frequently make one more attempt to pull you back into a dynamic that once benefited them. The way this attempt shows up is never exactly the same. For some people, it begins with an unexpectedly warm message that feels sincere, almost impossible to question. For others, it's a sudden emergency that supposedly only you can help solve. Sometimes the crisis is real, while other times it's carefully exaggerated to pull you back into their world. In many cases, they won't even contact you directly. Instead, mutual friends or relatives become messengers. You'll hear comments like, "They've been talking about you lately," or "They seem completely different now." Someone might tell you they've changed, that they're reflecting on everything that happened, or that they genuinely miss you. On the surface, it can feel convincing. But understanding the psychology behind these moments makes them much easier to recognize. A narcissist's emotional world depends heavily on what psychologists describe as narcissistic supply. This includes attention, admiration, emotional engagement, validation, and most importantly, the feeling of influence over another person's emotions. These experiences help support the fragile self-image they work so hard to maintain. For a long time, you were one of those dependable sources. Whether through arguments, reassurance, affection, or simply reacting to their behavior, you provided emotional fuel that reinforced their sense of importance. Even negative attention often served the same purpose because it confirmed they could still occupy your thoughts and shape your emotional state. When you leave completely without continuing the cycle, Without defending yourself and without giving them emotional access, that source disappears. The experience can resemble withdrawal. Not because they suddenly discovered genuine, healthy love, but because they lost something that had become psychologically useful. The absence creates discomfort they struggle to regulate internally, especially if they haven't found another person capable of filling the same role. That's why the Hoover shouldn't automatically be mistaken for reconciliation. It isn't necessarily an invitation to build a healthier relationship. More often, it's an attempt to restore a dynamic that once benefited them. The goal isn't simply to reconnect, it's to determine whether the emotional doorway is still open. Can they still pull you back? Can they still make you question yourself? Can they still influence your choices with a single conversation? Recognizing these attempts without being drawn into them is one of the clearest signs that your healing has taken root. The moment you see the pattern instead of the performance, you've already changed the outcome. Now let's look at the third sign. They begin performing for an audience. This behavior is far more subtle than outright manipulation, but once you recognize it, it's difficult to miss. After losing direct influence over you, many narcissists become unusually focused on broadcasting an image of success. Suddenly, their social media is filled with carefully selected moments that portray a perfect life. They showcase exciting experiences, post about new relationships, celebrate achievements, and project an almost exaggerated sense of happiness. Everything appears effortless, everything looks flawless, and yet something about it often feels strangely rehearsed. The timing, the frequency, and the choice of what they share can seem almost designed to reach one particular person, you. Psychologists sometimes describe a similar strategy through the idea of proxy control. When direct influence over someone has disappeared, an individual may attempt to affect that person indirectly by controlling what others see, hear, or communicate. Instead of speaking to you, they shape the environment around you, hoping the message eventually finds its way back. The intention is rarely just self-expression. They want you to believe they're happier without you. They want you to question whether leaving was the right decision. They hope you'll compare your healing process to the polished version of life they're displaying and wonder if you've made a mistake. Most importantly, they want a reaction. Even curiosity can feel like success from their perspective because it means they still occupy space in your attention. Interestingly, research in personality psychology has found that people with stronger narcissistic traits often become significantly more active on social media after relationship breakdowns. Increased online visibility can function as a way of restoring validation, rebuilding public image, attracting new admiration, or subtly communicating with former partners without ever speaking to them directly. That's why appearances alone rarely tell the whole story. What often looks like confidence from the outside may actually be a carefully managed performance designed to replace the control they no longer have in private. Instead, the posts become increasingly centered on image, achievement, and admiration. Every update seems carefully selected to communicate success, popularity, or status. The goal isn't simply to share life, it's to shape how life is perceived. There's an important difference between living well and constantly proving that you're living well. Real healing doesn't require a stage. Someone who has genuinely found peace rarely feels the need to convince strangers that they're happy. They aren't measuring their recovery through likes, comments, or public approval because their sense of stability comes from within. A narcissist, however, often depends on external validation to support an identity that feels fragile underneath. That's why self-promotion becomes louder when internal confidence grows weaker. What appears to be confidence is often a performance. Now let's move to the fourth sign. This one is surprisingly subtle, and because of that, many people overlook it. You probably won't witness it during a dramatic argument or some emotional showdown. Instead, it tends to appear during completely ordinary moments. You might cross paths at a grocery store, run into each other at a mutual friend's gathering, notice an unexpected reaction in the comment section of a post, or simply observe a brief interaction that lasts only seconds. Then it happens. A quick flash of irritation, an unusually harsh remark, a facial expression that changes before they can hide it. A moment of visible frustration that seems completely out of proportion to what actually occurred. These brief cracks matter because narcissists usually invest enormous effort into controlling how they're perceived. Maintaining the right image is one of their greatest priorities. They carefully manage their words, reactions, and public behavior so others continue seeing the version of themselves they've worked so hard to create. When that control slips, even for a few seconds, it often reveals that something much deeper is happening beneath the surface. Those small moments aren't random, they're signs of internal tension becoming harder to contain. Psychologically, what you're witnessing is the conflict between two realities. On one side is the carefully constructed identity they present to the world, confident, composed, unaffected, and in complete control. On the other side is the emotional reality they desperately try to avoid acknowledging: feelings of rejection, wounded pride, insecurity, and the painful awareness that they can no longer influence someone who once revolved around them. The wider that gap becomes, the more difficult it is to keep the mask in place. And every day you continue healing, every day you remain emotionally detached instead of simply physically distant, that distance grows even larger. Your freedom becomes a constant reminder that their old methods no longer work. That realization is often far more unsettling than any argument you could have had. As we come to the end of this conversation, there's one truth I want you to remember. Overcoming a narcissist was never about defeating them in an argument, exposing every lie, or finally hearing the apology they were never willing to give. The greatest victory is reaching the point where none of those things are necessary anymore. It's looking back without feeling the need to explain yourself. It's refusing to carry emotional battles that no longer belong to you. It's discovering that your peace no longer depends on whether they understand what they did. Eventually, you notice something remarkable. Instead of quietly moving on with their life, the narcissist often becomes increasingly focused on creating an image that demands attention. Their social media suddenly fills with carefully chosen photos, accomplishments, exciting experiences, expensive purchases, or posts that seem designed to highlight how successful, attractive, or admired they are. Every update feels intentional, almost as if each one has been crafted to send a message rather than simply share a moment. The purpose isn't just to let people know what's happening in their life. The deeper goal is to shape how everyone perceives them. There is a huge difference between genuinely enjoying your life and constantly trying to convince the world that you're living your best one. This is where real healing and narcissistic validation become completely different paths. A person who is truly healed doesn't need an audience to confirm that they're happy. They don't wake up wondering who noticed their latest achievement or whether someone from their past saw their newest photo. Their peace exists whether anyone applauds it or not. They don't rely on strangers to reassure them that they're doing well because their confidence comes from something much deeper than public approval. It's built on self-acceptance, emotional security, and the knowledge that they no longer need to prove their worth. For someone with strong narcissistic traits, however, external validation often becomes a psychological necessity rather than a pleasant bonus. Their self-image depends heavily on admiration, attention, and the reactions of other people. When that validation begins to disappear, they often compensate by becoming even more visible. The louder the self-promotion becomes, the more likely it is that something underneath feels uncertain or unstable. What appears to be confidence on the surface is frequently an attempt to protect a fragile sense of identity. That is why appearances can be misleading. What looks like complete confidence may actually be an ongoing performance. Now let's move to the fourth sign. This sign is much quieter than the others, which is exactly why so many people miss it. You probably won't see it during a dramatic confrontation or an emotional argument. Instead, it appears in the ordinary moments of everyday life. Maybe you unexpectedly pass each other in a grocery store. Maybe you attend the same family gathering or mutual friend's birthday. Perhaps they stumble across a comment you've left on someone else's post, even though it had nothing to do with them. Then, for just a brief moment, the carefully maintained image begins to crack. You notice a flash of irritation crossing their face before they quickly hide it. They make a sarcastic remark that seems strangely aggressive considering the situation. Their tone suddenly changes, or they react with an intensity that feels completely out of proportion to what actually happened. The moment is short, but it's revealing. These small slips matter because narcissists usually spend an enormous amount of energy managing how they're perceived. Controlling their public image is one of the skills they've practiced for years. They carefully choose their words, monitor their expressions, and present themselves in ways that support the identity they want others to believe. So when that control disappears, even for a few seconds, it often reveals emotional pressure that's becoming increasingly difficult to contain. Those reactions aren't random. They're signs that the distance between who they pretend to be and what they're actually feeling has grown much wider. On one side is the confident, untouchable image they present to the world. On the other is the emotional reality they try desperately to hide: rejection, wounded pride, insecurity, and the painful realization that they can no longer influence someone who once revolved around them. Every day you continue healing, every day you stop seeking their approval, and every day you remain emotionally free instead of simply physically absent, that gap grows larger. Your peace becomes undeniable proof that their old methods no longer work, and that truth is often far more painful for them than any argument or confrontation could ever be.